Dear friends, dear colleagues, so we have come to the last session of the main forum of the South-South forums, and we have had 8 previous sessions of passionate debates and intense interactions. So tonight, we are very honored to have with us 2 eminent speakers and 4 discussants who are as eminent. Our 2 speakers are Professor John Bellamy Foster and Professor Wang Hui. And our 4 discussants are Professor Boaventura de SOUSA SANTOS, Isabel MONAL, Issa, Professor Issa SHIVJI, and Professor Praveen. So I will introduce them as we invite them to speak. The overall theme of the 7th South-South Forum on Sustainability is climate change, global crisis, and community regeneration. In this last session of the main forum, we would like our panelists to take us to a philosophical and political deliberation of the theme, Eco-socialist alternatives to the global crisis. What our 2 speakers share in common is that they are both university professors, organic intellectuals, and current or former chief editor of an influential intellectual journal. John Bellamy Foster is editor of Monthly Review, and Wang Hui was editor of Dushu. One friend they had in common was Professor Samir Amin. So tonight, we will start with the question as a tribute to Samir Amin. How would we see Samir Amin's thesis about the implosion of capitalism? Do we see the current conjuncture of pandemics, economic downturn, and climate change, and the ensuing state and people's responses as a turning point in the global, regional, and national order? And how do we see the prominence of ecological struggles in relation to economic, social, and cultural struggles? So, would we think that the proposition of communism is as essential and as necessary today as a coherent alternative to capitalism and barbarism? If so, what would be the defining features of the communism that we would propose, philosophically, conceptually, and strategically? And it is the 10th year since the publication of the book, The Communist, the Idea of Communism, so which was presented by Alain BADIOU. So, and then there have been national strategies such as delinking. There have been social movement appeals such as climate justice and denuclearization. So, how do we see the connection among them? And last but not least, we would like to tackle the question of historical subject in the struggles for a future for humanity. So we have all these questions and many more. And so what I would do is I would like to invite our 2 speakers to first speak, each for 30 minutes. And then our 4 discussants to also each speak for 15 minutes. Then we will be inviting interventions from the floor. And then we will have a final round of a presentation by our 2 speakers. So once again, thank you for coming to this discussion, this dialogue. And of course, this would only be the start of the renewed tackling of the issues. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor John Bellamy Foster to speak.
I would like to talk about the renewal of the socialist ideal. And as you all know, the socialist ideal is communism in Marx's sense. First of all, we have to talk about the material conditions. Samir Amin talked about the implosion of capitalism quite a few years ago, but we certainly are seeing that now. I like to talk about what I call catastrophe capitalism, because what we are seeing is a merging of various crises associated with capitalism. There's an economic crisis, a crisis of accumulation under monopoly finance capital, or what Samir also called generalized monopoly capital. The crisis is one of stagnation and financial crises, over accumulation. We could talk about that in greater detail, but I think most people are familiar with the parameters of that at the present time. Then there's the planetary ecological crisis, of which climate change is the most prominent, but not the only part. We are faced with a planetary ecological crisis that is threatening within a very short period of historical time, human civilization and even human survival. And related to that is the epidemiological crisis, which has become so prominent with COVID-19. That's really a product of our ecological disaster and the growth of new zoonoses. And it seems like this problem is going to be with us permanently in one form or another as a result of the way in which we've organized our production, agribusiness, the destruction of ecologies, species, and so on, species habitats. Then there's the decline of the U.S. hegemonic imperial order, the crisis of imperialism itself, and particularly of U.S. hegemony, which threatens war, threatens militarization and war, and general instability. There's the crisis of the liberal democratic state that has spread to the advanced capitalist world itself, the center of the system. So we're seeing these two tendencies of neoliberalism and neo-fascism emerging. And what Samir said is the rise of a capitalism that fits the characteristics of totalitarianism, although it's never called that. And sometimes in a soft version, sometimes in a harder version. The global destruction of subsistence agriculture and peasant production has to be added to this because it's so fundamental in terms of world food production. So we have all of these crises happening simultaneously. They're interrelated. We can no longer think of the economic and ecological crises as completely separate. And it's best to see this in terms of catastrophe capitalism, which raises the most fundamental issues of human justice and even survival, and the preservation of the environment. So we're facing a material situation that, as the scientist says, is a no analog situation, no analog condition. We've never experienced anything quite like this before in terms of a threat to civilization in the broadest sense of the term. And so we're faced with catastrophe capitalism that bodes little for humanity except a rapid downward road and destruction. And once again, socialism is being renewed, but socialism is being renewed in all sorts of various ways. Often in what's called socialism is merely social democracy. It's merely reinforcing capitalism. And the confusion within the Marxist tradition remains. One of our problems is the whole inheritance of the two-stage model of socialism. So that, and this had some basis in Marx and Engels and was really developed by Lenin. And the notion that socialism is the transition stage, merging out of capitalism with all of its defects, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, the need to have a larger state, the putting off of fundamental issues of equality, focusing on to each according to their labor, as opposed to each according to their need. And the problem with this was not so much in the basic conception. It was that no socialist state has ever seen itself as communist, which would surprise a lot of people who are familiar with Cold War rhetoric, but no socialist state has ever seen itself as a communist state. But no socialist society at the present time, or possibly Cuba would be an exception, but no socialist state is actually declaring itself to be on the path to communism. And that's a problem, because communism for Marx and Engels wasn't really so separate from socialism. They were used interchangeably. And that the ideal, the object of the struggle, the emphasis on from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, substantive equality, a conception of the associated producers rationally regulating the metabolism between human beings and nature, the withering away of the state, all of the characteristics, and withering of the way of the state in terms of creating a kind of new communal state, all the things that we talked about in terms of communism were actually the ideal of socialism. And what happened was that the ideal of socialism was utopianized by socialists themselves. So they removed those ideals, those objects of struggle, from their notion of socialism, and became comfortable with living with the defects of the previous system, a kind of compromise solution that didn't go anywhere and didn't inspire anyone. And we ended up in an impasse. But we're in a situation now with what I'm calling catastrophe capitalism, but also with the sheer magnitude of the challenges facing us, that we can't really address the problems, particularly the ecological crisis, without restoring the socialist ideal, which was communism. We have to restore those objects of struggle, that emphasis on substantive equality, community, what Marx and Engels in the German ideology called the communist consciousness. And why is that? Well, we have to look at the reality that one thing that Engels used to talk about was freedom as necessity, taking that from Hegel. But we certainly are in that period now, or what Marx, in looking at the ecological crisis in Ireland, called ruin or revolution. He said this is the situation. Well, this is certainly the kind of situation we're facing now. We have an enormous ecological rift globally. There's a new study out by Mauricio Bentancur, who on Cuba, and on how Cuba is engaged in its agriculture with a metabolic rift in a major scientific journal. But hardly any other country in the world has taken on the ecological problem, even within socialist circles, in the way it needs to be done. Instead, we're accumulating catastrophe. We're accumulating the potential for destruction each and every year. I think, though, there is real potential for getting out of this, coming from the bottom of society, from a revolutionary struggle. And the way I think about it is that for a long time, we have thought of the economic problem and the ecological problem, to the extent that we've even addressed the latter, as completely separate. And we've seen socialism as a struggle over economic conditions. But this is increasingly abstract for people and meaningless. It will become increasingly meaningless. And I think that what we're going to see all over the world, and we are seeing emerging, is what we could call an environmental proletariat. The reason is that people's struggles are no longer just about their working conditions, their conditions in factories or other forms of production. But the struggles are, the material struggles are just as much about their urban environments, their relation to the land, the ecological problems that are pressing them on every level, access to water, food, and so on. This has been true for a long time in the global south, and so you see an emergence of an environmental proletariat where people are responding to material conditions that are equally economic and ecological, and they scarcely distinguish them anymore. And when you have that situation, when people are fighting not simply over their working conditions, but over their lives, and they see the connection between the two, then you have the emergence of an environmental proletariat. And I would even argue that if you looked at Engels's condition of the working class, or you looked at any of the revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and so on, that it's the case that when issues, struggles over work and struggles over community and environment come together, that you have the most vital revolutionary movements. And people are being forced down that track by the conditions that are rapidly developing. Nothing is stable in this period. We're seeing bigger changes in the human relation to the earth, and more disastrous ones than at any time in history. We're facing a condition where the scientific consensus says that if we don't make absolutely massive changes globally in our social relations, in our forces of production, within 20 or 30 years, which is unprecedented in world history, then the whole climate is likely to careen out of control. So if you listen to the scientists, they're saying something like a revolution on a bigger scale than we've ever seen before is necessary. Of course, they tend to not have the socialist background or knowledge, and knowledge of social science to put this together. So what do we need to do? We need a new system, as Isvan Mesros used to say, of social metabolic reproduction. We need a society that's geared to substantive equality and ecological sustainability. Those two things themselves basically add up to socialism as described by Marx. We need to focus on what could be called the elementary triangle of eco-socialism, building on the conceptions of both Marx and Chavez. We need a social use, not ownership, of nature. We need a rational regulation by the associated producers of the metabolism of humanity and nature. That's of production and the labor process, but Marx saw it fundamentally as a metabolism of a social metabolism between humanity and nature. A metabolism right now that is being destroyed. We need the satisfaction of communal needs, including those of future generations. We have to think in terms of time. We need new constitutive cells of society. Right now, the reason that capitalism in particular needs the kind of antagonistic state it has is because the constitutive cells of capitalism are atomistic individuals. A competitive dog-eat-dog world is what's at the base of this system. They need an antagonistic state for that purpose. There is nothing at the bottom of this kind of society that really creates social coherence, and the state holds it together in the interests of the capitalist class. We need to create new constitutive cells of society based on communities, communes, collectives, and where the constitutive cells are not destructive but constructive, where we are able to build on the basis of a participatory democracy, which, in my view, is the essence of communism. And we need a social planning, we need social control, but the control, the planning has to a large extent, come from the bottom, in alliance with a communal state. We need to focus on the objectives of communism as an ideal, the socialist ideal. We can't survive through the crises that we're seeing in the world today without an emphasis on substantive equality. Equality has to be the basis. As Bolivar said, equality is the law of laws. We have to have ecological sustainability. To get there is difficult. I think that Samir was right in his approach to the International. Chavez and Meseros were both talking about Chavez was going to initiate a struggle for a new International as soon as he got through his last election. That is, this was the plan that he had prior to his illness, the cancer coming down on him. And he was going to try to introduce a new International. And Meseros and Chavez decided to call it the New International rather than a Fifth International, term that Samir initially used, because they wanted to set aside the whole issue of 1, 2, 3, and 4 internationals and start somewhat afresh, and see if there was another way to link workers and peoples. And Samir, in the end, came out with what he called a demand for an international of workers and peoples. And I thought this was quite brilliant, because it can no longer be simply a workers' international, although workers are at the basis of everything. But we have to recognize peoples, we have to take into account nationality and race. And so there was a demand by Samir at the end. We move beyond social forums and create an international of workers and peoples with the inversion of imperialism as its primary objective, as the most fundamental thing in dealing with capitalism. So one of the things I wanted to emphasize in all of this is that by having the two-stage conception, this sort of stages conception of socialism and communism, which was important in one sense, it helped clarify certain things within the socialist movement, but those stages got frozen, and the whole notion of communism, with all of the fundamental objectives and ideals of socialism, got put aside, almost permanently put aside, as no longer really in question. But it's exactly those things that we need to be fighting for, and that have to be our objectives all along, and have to be inscribed on our banners. We have a certain telescoping of history now. It's a very odd situation, because, as everybody knows, the social forces on the ground are not developed, while the crisis that capitalism has brought onto us on a planetary level is developing very, very rapidly. But as Marx said in a letter to Engels, the days can become like years, and years can become like centuries, and we have to recognize that in human history, change can occur very volcanically, very suddenly, and particularly if people have an object of struggle and know that freedom, and when freedom and necessity come together, when we can only deal with our material conditions, material challenges, by also expanding human freedom, then the struggle can move forward very rapidly. Samir always emphasized the audacity of movements and our need to be much more audacious in how we formulated things, in our notions of change, in really putting forward platforms and taking actions. And I think this is important. I wanted to end with a reference to the protests that have occurred in the United States, influenced by the what we call the police lynching of George Floyd, and the protests were inspired a lot by Black Lives Matter, but in every city in the United States, there are massive protests on a scale that really hasn't been seen, a level of protest that hasn't been seen in the United States since maybe the US Civil War. It was so large, and this has left an imprint on the society. We don't know how deep. It's a question of organization. But one of the things that has to be understood about the protests that happened in the United States recently, this massive set of protests that occurred within Fortress America, within the very center of the world system, which shows just how hollow the system is. What's important to understand with respect to these protests is that it was over the murder of a Black man, and over the oppression of the Black population in the United States. It was a protest against what is increasingly understood as racial capitalism. And what we saw was something new. They call them the solidarity protests, because for the first time, the white population in the United States, really the working class population in the United States, came out in massive protests over racism and over racial oppression in the United States. And this didn't happen in the civil rights era. You did not see the white population protesting on behalf of the Black population. This is unique. And I think it's important when we look at these solidarity protests and we recognize that they actually come from a class basis. It shows us, particularly in terms of the United States, where we're always told nothing can change. It tells us that solidarity in the world is possible, that we can fight against racial capitalism, imperialism, and we can do it together. Thank you.
So we just heard from Professor John Bellamy Foster. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Oregon and editor of Monthly Review. He has written about a political economy of capitalism and economic crisis, ecology and ecological crisis, and Marxist theory. And among the many books he has written, there are The Vulnerable Planet, Marxist Ecology, The Ecological Revolution, The Ecological Rift, and Marx and the Earth. So now we would like to invite Professor Wang Hui to speak for 30 minutes. Professor Wang Hui is a professor of history and literature of Tsinghua University. He's director of the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Sciences. And he has also authored many books, including the 4 volumes of The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought, and also China's new order, the end of the revolution, and China from empire to nation state. So, Professor Wang Hui, please.
It's my great honor and a great pleasure to share some ideas with all of our friends and comrades. And Kingji asked me to say something about the idea of communism, but after the consideration, I think that the first I would like to say something about how to, what we can learn from the 20th century socialism and what we can imagine or to think about the 21st century, the socialism. That's the limits of the old idea of equality and whether or not we can develop some new ideas based on the old idea and following for the transformation. So following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist state and East Europe, throughout the world, there have emerged varied kinds of the social movements. The socialism of the 21st century in Latin America, the peasant armed struggle in South and East Asia, such as those in Nepal and India, have sought to sustain the revolutionary heritage of the 20th century. Yet, under the new conditions, the prospects for such movements are unclear. In the advanced capitalist societies and in the so-called transitional countries, none of the social protests that I think before, that Occupy movements, labor movements, and large-scale protest movements here and there were able to fundamentally alter the state of the early stage of the so-called depoliticization. That's why the Alain Badiou's analysis of that, based on that, still thought was not in the stage. John mentioned that the moment the solidarity protests show something really new, combine different things together. That may be, I think, the new starting point. But in any case, social inequality, financial crisis, spread of the epidemic, ecological destruction, the political crisis that have accompanied development of globalization, as well as discussions around the systemic crisis of capitalism, have arisen one and after another. Yet even whilst we are confronted by the new premonitions of disasters and the weakest links of the global capitalism are visible for all to see, any political forces that might be able to shatter these links fall far short of the force with which the current epidemic has assaulted us. The political landscape of the contemporary world has not yet escaped the shadow of defeat of the socialist experiments of the 20th century. To use the formulation of Alain Badiou, the period from the October Revolution of 1917 up until the end of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1976 constituted the second communist sequence following the Paris Commune, and even a sequence of the moments in which the communist hypothesis was put into practice. He postulates that the primary content of this sequence, that the Marxism, the workers' movement, democracy, Leninism, Vanguard Party, and the socialist state apparatus, has ceased to be applicable. And he said that the second sequence is over and it's pointless to try to restore it. So the tide of the neoliberalism has in turn given rise to right-wing, conservative, nationalist, and populist trends. And sometimes the most shocking is that in some way, amidst these trends, the laborers who have lost their jobs and the social protection have become supporters of those, sometimes the right-wing politics. at precisely the moment that liberals are decrying the rise of populism, why is it that left-wing politics has lost the support of the workers lost the belts and fallen into a state of the complete impotence? Why is it that the innumerable resistance movements lack any clear political capacity and instead constantly fall into the traps of the racism, xenophobia, and identity politics? In addition to the departure of the vanguard party and large-scale class movements, the most easily identifiable phenomena includes the weakness of the leadership, the absence of tactical strategic discussions in left-wing theory, and the decline of line debates surrounding the concrete paths for the social transformation. Theoretical debates surrounding political line, political economy, military strategy, and tactics, as well as how on unfavorable positions to win power, comprise precisely the political legacy of the 20th century. So in that sense, on the one hand, maybe we can argue that, as Alain BADIOU said, that it's the second sequence is over and it is pointless to try to restore it. But on the other hand, I think still we can learn something from the experience in the 20th century socialist experiments and the socialist revolution. In his January 1915 article on the false flag, Lenin put forward the methodology for distinguishing the specific features of an epoch. He said that we are undoubtedly living at the juncture of two epochs, and the historical events that are unfolding before our eyes can be understood only if we analyze, in the first place, the objective conditions of the transition from each one epoch to other. Here we have important historical epochs. In each of them, there are and will always be individual and partial moments, now forward, now backward. There were and will always be various deviations from the average type and the main tempo of the moment. We cannot know how rapidly and how successfully the various historical moments in a given epoch will develop. But we can and do know which class stands at the heart of one epoch or another, determine its main content, the main direction of its development, the main characteristics of the historical situation in that epoch. Only on that basis, and by taking into account, in the first place, the fundamental distinctive features of various epochs, can we correctly involve our tactics. Only our knowledge of the basic feature of a given epoch can serve as the foundation for our understanding of the specific feature of one country or another. Contrary to the Lenin's epoch perspective, that opportunism, whether leftist, rightist, leftist on the surface, but the rightist on the substance, dogmatic or imperialist, consists of confusing the specific features and the development directions of different epochs, blurring the central powers of the different epochs, and furthermore applying the certain strategies and the policies that may be correct or appropriate for one epoch to an entirely different epoch. So yes, it is pointless to restore 20th century politics, but we still can learn a lot from this great legacy. So Lenin's theory of imperialism was precisely such a living development of his methodology of recognizing the epoch. If it might be said that the unevenness of the imperialist world system gave rise to a series of weakest links within that system, then so too did the internal fractures created by situation of great power competition create a series of weakest links within China itself. Thus, the internal national fractures produced by the situation of great power competition provided the weakest links for the national revolution. So there is imperialist epoch, two kinds of the weakest link. One is that which Lenin described in these terms: uneven economic and political development is the absolute law of capitalism. Hence, the victory of the socialism is possible first in absolute law, first in several or even in one capitalist country alone. The other consists of the cracks and the features created by the situation of uneven economic and political development within one country, as well as the contradictions between the agents of imperialism among the oppressed people. These later kind of the weakest link provided the conditions for the survival and development of the force of the Chinese Revolution in the vast expanse of the countryside, as well as in the border regions between the provinces and in peripheral regions. So is it possible for us to re-raise the question, where is the weakest link of the global capitalism in the 21st century? So the 20th century ago, the Samir Amin already developed his analysis for the current crisis of the global capitalism. His symptoms for these were, the first of all, he saw that the global system of capitalism didn't develop a kind of the new form, the social political new form, which beyond the nation state and which can fit the adaptable to the global the production system. The second, it's also not possible to didn't develop the new relations for the rise of the Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So still the whole system based on he famously described the five monopolies, that the monopoly of technology, monopoly of finance, monopoly of natural resources, monopoly of the media of communication, and a monopoly of massive destruction of weapons. But now we can also see something, the transformation, maybe some new possibilities. That monopoly on the technology was not the absolute. That's why we can see the battles on the new technologies of Huawei and so on and so forth. And also the mass media in a universal crisis created the new possibilities, and what kind of the new, what kind of the opportunity we can create the new situation. These are the issues. So the weakest link not only marks the weak points in the ruling order, but also indicates the possibility of the rupturing that system. Thus, the weakest link cannot exist of its own accord, but relies on the formation of a revolutionary force. The revolutionary forces of the 20th century didn't exist in isolation within a single state or territory, but were national, class struggle, and territorial movements which possessed a deep international linkage with one and each other, and which emerged in the weakest links. In other words, without the revolutionary forces and our revolutionary theory committed to rupturing with the ruling order, the weakest links would simply not exist. Without being able to conceptualize the weakest links of the capitalist world system and the weakest links of the national state powers together, it is difficult to form the revolutionary strategy and tactics. With respect to the revolutionary situation, imperialism is understood solely as an economic phenomenon rather than understanding imperialism as rooted in a situation of political military competition that emerges from economic demands. And if one fails to grasp that between the old colonial policy and the new imperialism, there exists no sharp defined boundary, then as a result, it is impossible to form a concrete strategy and tactics for resisting imperialism. In this sense, without a revolutionary strategy and tactics, the weakest link cannot become the weakest link in the full sense of the word. Thus, being able to truly discern who comprises revolutionary forces, or locating the point of departure for developing revolutionary forces, comprise the premise for being able to discern the weakest link. So, here, I want to say something because recently, under the unique condition of the 20th century China, that the People's War emerged as a process for the production of new kind of political subject, as well as the process for the production of political structure and the form of the self-expression of adequate to the political subject. In the course of the People's War, the representative relationships of the modern political party were fundamentally transformed. The birth of a political subject based on the peasants as its primary component and with the worker-peasant alliance as its external political form compared to formation or transformation of all political forms, including the border region government, the political party, the peasant association, trade union, and so on. The general principle of People's War include, firstly, that only through the relying on and mobilizing the masses it is possible to conduct the war. Second, not only is it necessary to have a great conventional army, but so must there be local armed detachments and military. Thirdly, that's the category of military designate a political process that is centered on the land reform and the construction of the political power, and which has close links with the military struggles. So when we think about these different kind of the social movements, and we can rethink about the political innovation or the creation, whether or not these kind of the solidarity protests, and how can we generate the new politics, and what kind of because of the integration or the interconnectedness of different crises together, whether or not we can develop some kind of the new politics following these new developments. So that's what I think about these the inspiration from the 20th century experience. In the recent fight of the epidemic, we know that in the absence of the vaccine against the coronavirus, only the social system is truly capable of preventing the disease. In China, the rural areas, the posting of the cadres to the villages and the township in recent years has allowed the state administrative power to reach down to the village level. In the process of resisting the epidemic in many areas, it was these post cadres who took the lead in mobilizing the cadres and the party members in the village. Yet, the fundamental force is closely tied to the existing structure of the social organization in the village, including, for example, some old people engaged in daily work through the Senior Citizen Association and the cadres of the village committee. These preventative measures have included the forms such as self-protection, as well as the isolation and the quarantine. But if there should emerge even more serious epidemic, the direct intervention of the government will be necessary. Otherwise, conflictual events may be anticipated. In the urban districts, the residents come from many different places, but it is the street committees that have borne responsibility for the work of epidemic prevention. The residence committees of these neighborhoods have experienced various kinds of the contradictions with residents over the years with respect to district management and defending legal rights. In terms of their interests and the personal relationships, they have had varied disagreements with the residents, and so in the course of the implementations, they have had a line with district the real estate, but the real estate follows a commercial logic, whereas the street level committees followed administrative orders, such that the two have become the amalgamated amidst the epidemic, but have not become an organic unity. Speaking comparatively, work unit, dormitory districts and older districts in the city centers have been able to sustain more traditional neighborhood relations as well as socialist elements. And so too is the organic character of their organization stronger. But in any case, the problems of the mobilization and organization are the key to understanding how China was able to gain the victory in the early stage of its anti-epidemic struggle. But that were, so in the absence of the real People's War, we know that the reuse of the term of the People's War during recently, during the fight against the epidemic, the state system often degenerated into the malpractices of the formalism, bureaucraticism. But on the other hand, precisely under these conditions, under these conditions of emergency, protecting the safety of people's life is given top priority. Economic activities are limited to meet the basic needs of people's everyday life. The capital appreciation and expansion are relegated to a secondary position. Thus, the really seeing capacity of the People's War have once again demonstrated their efficacy by providing the greatest guarantee of the victory in the first stage of fighting the epidemic. Under the conditions of emergency, the flood relief, earthquake relief, epidemic relief, might these re-emergent capacities of 20th century legacy be able to become something more than merely being methods of the state mobilization and reignite the agency and active role of the people, and once again compel unity between the people and the whole political system. Under contemporary conditions, might these capacities be able to resolve the rupture of the political and social forms and provide a motive force for new social political forms? So that these are real questions for us to rethink about the possibilities of the new politics. Here, the last part, I try to summarize some the ideas I early also talk about the 5 criteria of the social equality. I think that we need to go beyond the old idea, integrate the old idea maybe of the equality into the new idea. The social equality and the openness to social experience have been fundamental building block of the Chinese, the early experience, focusing on the modern experience of China. I will define equality in terms of the 5 objectives, which can only be achieved when the 5 objectives are presented in a comprehensive form. That's why what kind of the transformation to the new the socialism is extremely important for these. We know that the first equality criterion, which is the equal opportunity condition, was put forward in the era of European bourgeois revolution. Equality of opportunity is also defined in the sense of legal rights. The second equality criterion refers to the distributive justice. This criterion goes back to the socialist legacy, heritage, and has recently been discussed by many people. Distributive justice also involves rights, but on the premise of the obligations. In the experience of the past 30 years also, this criteria has been badly overlooked, and nowadays it is necessary to rediscover and redefine it. In China's, I think that the healthcare system and the over-marketized the system need to be changed. The orientation towards a more public and socialized. And in China's poverty relief project, the transfer payment system in poor area is one of the example, for the redistributive the equality. So if you look at the backgrounds, that the picture was took last year when I went back to my the county. 30 years ago, after 1989, I was sent there to spend the year in 1990 there. And I found that a lot of the changes, especially the ecological improvement, was really important, because now the whole poor areas, the green coverage was reached to the 67%. The third equality is equality of capability, which has been systematically discussed by Amartya Sen. This concept of equality arises from the dynamic interdependence of the comprehensive equality of opportunity and equality of results. In China's historical experience, the equal distribution of education resources has been a fundamental prerequisite for the creating equality of access to the building of capabilities. But now we still faced the widening of these, especially the rural crisis. In addition to the three main concepts of equality mentioned above, I propose two new ones. My fourth equality concept is more or less come from the traditional the philosophy, which is the equality of all unequals, so the equality of all things, which may also call the diversity equality. One characteristic of modern egalitarianism is the equality of form, which can be defined only by placing people in the same legal condition. This means that there have always been antagonism and a tension between equality and diversity, as diversity is often synonymously with rank from the perspective of formal equality. In instance of this issue is the challenge presented by China's regional ethnic autonomy, which can be described as a crisis of diversity equality or differential equality, but also suggests that in the Chinese tradition, and especially in the socialist practice, the concept of diversity equality is embodied at the institutional level, which leads to the diversity on the premise of equality. The institutional embedding of the diversity equality makes the diversity and equality mutually complementary rather than opposed to each other. This is the central feature of what we may call the cross-system society. In this type of society, difference or diversity are not rooted in the nationalistic premises, but are the precondition of the forming a community. In this way, difference or diversity do not presuppose the essentialism, but are the product of historical change. They are indeed the product of historical process in which change, integration, and communication are not aimed at cancelling the difference and diversity. Equality of difference or the equality of diversity are opposed to the homogenization tendency of capital and the capitalist finance, and are also opposed to the social model of market law. The formal equality of modern capitalism is the negation of equality of diversity. The Chinese socialist experience bears traces of the capitalist emphasis on the formal equality and development as convergence to a single dynamic path. For this reason, it failed to accomplish the full potential of the diversity equality project. However, the success or the failure of the practice of these in modern China provides important evidence of problems to be faced when implementing that project. So the fifth, I think, the concept of equality is internationally oriented equality. What I'm considering here is not only the equality between nations, as discussed, for instance, at the 1955 Bandung Conference. What I'm referring to here is how equality within a society should encompass its international orientation. For instance, the internationalism of modern Chinese history is also part of the Chinese experience. So-called globalization, which is mainly caused by the transnational development of capital, production, and consumption, permeates every sphere of the social life within the individual countries. Western democracy is based on the premise of civil rights. Citizenship is a precondition of the concept of modern equality. However, in the context of the globalization, the development mode of any society will have an impact on the development patterns of other societies. For large societies such as China, United States, and all European Union, any domestic decision-making could have a huge impact on other societies. On the current democratic models, people outside the political community have no right to participate in the choices taken by the community, as participation in the decision-making process presuppose the condition of the citizenship. For example, United States, which is the most energy-consuming the country of the world, refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol, and as the hegemonic power has waged wars on other countries, but only the United States Congress had decision-making capacity on such matters. All these are the same for other countries, especially for those large-scale countries. In that sense, when John mentioned that the solidarity protests, which give us the hints that the solidarity protests not only happened, we need these kind of the solidarity not happened within one country, but across the borders, and find the dimension of the new internationalism in the 20th century. So in that sense, we can these kind of the new idea of the equality only became possible in the process of the long transformation towards the new socialism. Thank you.